Hi everyone, I'm Carmen, Managing Digital Editor of Ms. Magazine, and I am here with Tracy Strauss. Hello.
It's great to be here.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm actually so excited because we're here to talk about Tracy's book, I Just Haven't Met You Yet, Finding Empowerment in Dating, Love, and Life. And the reason I love that we're talking about the book is because we actually published your essay about how you were having trouble getting someone to publish your story. And so, yeah, I guess I always sort of start with an inception story, but I know that also is something you sort of dig into here, which is basically, you know, you're a survivor, you're talking about being a survivor, and you also talk about really learning to tell your story and the fear and also the pressure that other people put on you who thought it wasn't a good idea to tell your story. So how has it been sort of really getting to put it down on paper in this format and, yeah, putting it out into the world?
It's been amazing. It's kind of surreal that it's actually happened. When I wrote that essay, I really thought that it was over, that was just the end of trying to get my story out there. It had been 10 years and the doors just kept shutting. And then the essay happened and the doors opened. And so it's been great to have it out there.
Totally. And I know you also went through sort of a few different iterations of what the book looked like. So how did you sort of settle on this and this really unique frame of an open letter to your future life partner? What was it like to write from that really vulnerable place?
Yeah, you know, it took me a while to be able to write from that place. When I first started writing my story, it was very early on in my PTSD recovery, and so I didn't have the perspective or the you know, a way of reflecting on my experience. And so it took me a number of years of my own recovery work and healing to actually get that perspective. And so the book, you know, I began with a core story of survival, and then moved on to talking about other areas of my life that had been affected by what had happened to me. And then also along the way, you know, life was happening, and I was going along different paths, and in trying to publish my story, I was also getting a lot of feedback from people in the industry about what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of what stories would be published and what stories people would read.
What's a good survivor narrative and what's a bad survivor narrative?
Right. Or is a survivor narrative even marketable? I generally would get a lot of praise about the writing, and then I would get a decline. And there was one of two reasons. One was that there was no readership for trauma, in particular sexual abuse survivor stories. The other was that the market was flooded. And so these are, you know.
So two exact opposite excuses.
And I would say, well, what's the truth? Which one is it? And then I really grew to understand that it had more to do with a culturally conditioned fear about acknowledging sexual violence, about talking about it, hearing about it, dealing with it, doing something about it. And that I needed to find people in the business who would have the courage to actually take it on. And so along the way, like I would go to writers' workshops and work on the craft, and I got a sense of reader response to the content, and started to understand, you know, I need to actually deal with a lot of the cultural conditioning on the page and through various techniques. And one of those techniques is levity, right? Levity and pacing. And so I started to think about other threads to bring into my story. And then, you know, life just kind of converged, and the dating scene really started to make its way into my writing. And I had tried so many ways to meet my life partner, but I did not try writing him a letter. So that's where that grew out of.
Awesome. And I'm interested, like the essay you wrote for us sort of touched on that idea of like, you know, in the wake of this Me Too explosion, that there was this really big interest in survivor stories, but yet there was still so little space for specifically abuse survivors to tell their stories. And so what, you know, do you feel like you've been able to push that narrative by putting this book out there? Do you feel like you've been able to sort of start those conversations?
I hope so. I think there are other writers who are doing it as well. I think that the Me Too movement has helped with sort of opening the door for people to have these conversations, but I still think there's a long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I know we were talking about this a lot before we turned on the camera, but that I was just, the whole time I was reading this book, I kept thinking, you know, this frame of sort of like, oh, here's some life-changing love lessons. Here's like one woman's experience trying to meet people using like online dating or, you know, going to social events. Yeah, like stuff like that. And that kind of stuff is, you know, stuff we've all seen before on different websites or in different books. Like there's definitely a cottage industry for books about dating, romance, how to find a partner, how to attract the partner that you're meant for. But this was the first time I ever sort of saw or encountered a book in which it was really about relationships, but it was also about the way your trauma impacted, you know, the trajectory of your relationships and what you were gonna expect from a partner. And what I loved a lot too is that it ultimately did make you so independent and strong. And you're sort of saying in this book, you know, I do want partnership and I want companionship, but I also don't want it in this very tired frame of, you know, you're my protector or I'm dependent on you. And so, you know, it stuns me that this is sort of the first time that's ever come up, because we know that, you know, trauma isn't rare in women's lives. It's something that far too many women experience and live with and carry with them on their journeys. And I'm curious, like, have you encountered in writing this book and in talking about it with people, has that been a theme? Have you sort of encountered this idea of other survivors who are also asking themselves that question of like, how can I, you know, where's the relationship advice that really suits my experience?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Yeah, so for a long time, I would go to the bookstore and I was looking for a book that spoke to me about my experience. And I found books about dating by celebrities who had their whole entourage of hair and makeup stylists and, you know, nice looking partners by their side and camera people and all that. And, or there were the how-to books, the sort of cookie cutter how-to books, and lots of other types of books. And I understood that I wasn't alone in my problem of searching for a partner, but I didn't find a viable solution. And I was looking for a book that really spoke to what it meant to be an ordinary woman who had experienced and worked to overcome hardship and struggles and came out on the other side. And I wanted to have a book that had to do with empowerment. A lot of books in particular that deal with trauma and sexual abuse, assault, harassment, I think, are sensationalized, or they're presented in a way that's salacious, as if that is a more palatable way of sharing these stories. But I think that we do a real disservice to our readers as well as to survivors and people who know survivors by portraying sexual violence in that way. The way that we tell these stories shows others how to talk about it, shows others how to deal with it, how to cope with it. And so I think to enact change, we really need to be very purposeful about the tone. And so that was really important to me. And so now that the book is out, I've had a lot of people, survivors and people who know survivors, or people who aren't, you know, it's rare, but people who haven't been touched by sexual violence, who have had other types of traumas, come up to me and talk about the realness factor, and to be able to talk about things in an honest way, in an open way, is somehow freeing. You know, if we can actually get rid of the shame and speak to each other in a way that's open and honest, it's more empowering, I think, than diminishing. The salacious type of approach, I think, has been in our society just too long, and I think has we need a new kind of storytelling.
And I mean, and storytelling that goes beyond the story of,
Right.
you know, this happened to me,
Right.
which is so important. You know,
Right.
it's important that survivors are sharing their stories, but I did love that this was sort of like, you know, this happened and this happened,
Yes.
and then I went to
Yes.
whiskey tasting and tried to meet someone and it didn't work out. This happened and then I went to college. This happened and then I got this job, you know, and
Right.
the journey of healing.
Right.
And you've written a lot prior to this book about your experiences as a survivor and the work that you've done to work through your trauma. And I'm curious, like, I assume that your writing is a source of healing for you. And so I'm curious sort of how this book played into that healing process too.
That's a really good question. I think, you know, for me, writing this book was about more than healing. It was, for me, an act of transcendence. And
I love that.
Yeah, like, you know, and I think that sharing our stories, we are not what happened to us. And so to create some kind of art form out of something tragic, I think creates meaning and purpose to something that otherwise feels very meaningless and purposeless. And so that was something that was important to me. But I also was very cognizant that, you know, you can write for yourself or you can write for an audience. I don't look at writing this book as writing for me. Ultimately, it is writing for my readers. And so I took care of myself in therapy. And, you know, in very early stages of writing about my story, I wrote drafts for me and then understood that I was having a conversation with a lot of people. And so I needed to guide them through that terrain. Some of it is difficult terrain, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, the book is more about just sort of my own healing. That's a very small part of it. It's more about communicating a story, and not even just trauma, but like, okay, so naming it, working through it, and then transcending it, right? Like, how do you have a full life? How are you a whole person, even when really hard things have happened to you? And I think a lot of people don't have that hope or that belief that is still possible, you know. And so that's an important message, I think, that I learned both in writing the book and in sharing the book.
Awesome. Yeah. And how do you know, like, this is an open love letter to your future partner.
Yeah.
And how do you feel like what do you think ultimately, how do you think being a survivor does impact the kind of sort of the way you're gonna be seeking a relationship and sort of what all of this stuff really means to you? Like, why, sort of, I guess, just what is the empowerment that you're looking for? And how do you think that being a survivor has really shaped your journey elsewhere in your life and your relationships?
Mm-hmm. I think the empowerment factor is in learning how to just be myself and to be authentically me. And yes, I survived sexual violence, but that is not who I am, right? It is something that happened to me and affected me, but I've made it to the other side. And so, so in looking at a relationship, you know, I do have this history, and for many years, I was told it was a taboo history because in our society, we just didn't talk about it, right? And so I think it's important for me to communicate that is part of my history and affects certain aspects of my life, but it is not all of me. Like, I'm so much more, and you see that in the book, right? There's so many different aspects to my life other than this trauma. And actually, that was something that I really had to push back against with the publishing industry, because my story was about so much more than sexual abuse, you know, and they would just zero in on this context like it was the entire story. And so that's important for me. I think not even just in, you for a partnership, but friendships, any type of relationship, I think to know that like we all have something, we all have baggage, right? Nobody escapes life without baggage. Even the people on the dating profiles who are like, no baggage, I don't have any baggage. That's not true. But I think that baggage, it gets a bad name, but it can really be an asset in a relationship. When you've gone through something difficult, you have a greater capacity to empathize with a partner. You have a greater capacity to understand a struggle and how people can work through struggle. It doesn't define them. And so I think it's given me a lot more to bring to a relationship and to make a successful relationship. And so I'm looking for someone who has that same kind of quality. And that's what the book is about, is that search for that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And then, and I know we were talking about this earlier too, that there's also this other taboo that I loved in this book is you really openly talking about all of this. I mean, I think that there's so much expectation for everyone, but especially for women to make things look effortless, right? Like, oh, yeah, everything's working out. I'm fine. Everything's fine. Here's my partner. Everything's great, blah, blah, blah. And also there's still a lot of pressure on women to be partnered. Mm-hmm. And I loved that. I felt like this was a book about seeking partnership and companionship that didn't rely on those tropes of this idea of I need a partner to be whole or complete, but then also that you were being really open and sharing a lot about the fact that that like, this is where I was in my 20s. This is where I was in my 30s, that I'm in my 40s and I'm single. And so what has it been like? Has that sort of come up or surprised you in a way with the reception of the book? I feel like that's not a story that we hear a lot. That's not a story I think that women get to tell a lot is, I'm someone who is X age and I'm not partnered, but I do want to be partnered. I feel like a lot of times it's sort of like, well, we're just not going to talk about that. Those sorts of those women don't exist. We're just not going to talk about them.
It's not sexy. It's not,
Exactly. And with all of this sort of cultural stigma, I remember I just kept reading it and thinking like, oh, I wonder if that was really hard to say. And it seems silly to feel that way because this is a book that contains so much heavy stuff about sexual abuse. And then I'm sort of like, I wonder if it was hard for her to write about being single, like in her 30s. But was it?
It really was, but then I think I just forgot about it because I started to meet more and more people who were in the same position, and it's just that we don't talk about it openly because it's just not something. It's not something that the media talks about, or it's talked about like with a shame factor, and it's really just a fact of life. It really is just a fact of life. So I think in actually writing about it in this book, it's just. Hopefully anyway allows people to just get rid of the shame factor, and we're all kind of in this together. And I think too that the search for a partner is really a journey to finding your strongest self, and it's not looking for, at least in my experience, it's not looking for someone to complete you or complete your life. Like it's not the box that you check off, done, now I'm complete.
It's like, all right, scratch that one off, life is done, got it hooked up.
But it's just I think it's just part of being human. We seek companionship. We all have different preferences for what that companionship looks like, and I think we all have that right to find a happy relationship. I don't mean happy like there are no problems, but I mean fulfilling, and something where there's growth, there's love, there's the things that you value most in life.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm like, this is so amazing. I am so excited. And if you are Tracy's future life partner or anyone who's interested in hearing us talk more about the book, you can find us tonight at Diesel Books in LA, where we'll be talking more about it. And that link is in the description of the video. And yeah, I'm just like, thank you so much for writing this. I know you probably hear all these words a lot and roll your eyes at them, like brave, courageous, but really just so brave and beautiful and really moving book about your journey. And I loved it. I really did. It's a gem. Read it immediately. I'll also put a link to buy the book in the video description. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Carmen.
And I'll see you guys soon.
Bye.